the body can reallocate energy to prioritize systems like immune responses. And why all this matters, and this model helps to explain it, is why adding more cardio eventually stops the needle moving, why fat loss will plateau even with like really, really high training loads, and why people really can't out-train a poor diet. Hello, so let's go. We are talking about metabolism today. Not the first time I've touched on this topic, but for podcast 51, the title is How and Why Your Metabolism Adapts. And I guess more importantly, should you worry about it? So if you are engaged in fitness, media, social media, I'm sure you've heard people talk about either a slowing metabolism, a metabolism that speeds up. Maybe it's a supplement that can boost your metabolism. And I want to talk about metabolism as a whole and an understanding around metabolic adaptation. A lot of people might have heard, like, if you diet, your metabolism adapts, and it's framed around some sort of like negative thing where people can't lose weight. So I really want to go through in this episode and make sure you fully understand how metabolisms adapt and why they adapt, because then that way when you listen to people talk about a slowing down of metabolism, potentially in that context it actually could be correct. The metabolism might be slowing down based on what someone is saying, but it's not usually a negative thing. It's usually a very, very sensible, like what you'd expect element of human metabolism, because our metabolisms are flexible. First of all, let's just define metabolism, which I've done a few times on my podcast. But metabolism really is the overall energy that your body uses every day. So the biggest chunk of that is going to be your basal metabolic rate, or your resting metabolic rate. And that is the energy that your organs need just to sustain basic like life functions and to keep you alive. You then have the thermic effect of feeding, so the amount of energy your body uses to digest food. And then there are activity energy expenditure elements. So that's anything from just fidgeting and like shivering to going for a walk, anything like up to intense activity. And at first, that's where we're going to place our attention. So most people in the sort of like calories in, calories out conversation think of energy expenditure as an additive model. More calories burnt by doing more exercise equals like a faster metabolism overall. And I want to push back on that and talk about where the research sits with it. So the body does adapt to energy expenditure. Why does it do that? Mainly because the body is trying to maintain homeostasis. It wants to try and keep the internal systems quite balanced, and potentially it might need to conserve energy for survival. And when we diet or we train really hard, the body can compensate by reducing certain processes to preserve energy. So I mentioned that resting energy expenditure, or resting metabolic rate, that might fall. Hormones like your thyroid, leptin, reproductive hormones can downregulate. One of the things that's quite logical is that when you're working out really hard, you don't need to use your reproductive organs, so blood flow to that area will reduce. But if you're also using a lot of energy all the time, then reproductive function in that moment in time isn't necessarily a priority. So again, the body can shift energy around, or shift how much energy is going to these functions around. Innate, as I mentioned, sort of spontaneous movement like fidgeting can decline. And these changes, they're not failures. They're a protective adjustment to help your body survive during periods of low energy availability. So very much a evolutionary survival mechanism. Of course, the challenge is that in evolution, we had periods of low energy availability, whereas now we live in a food environment where food is abundant. Yes, we create periods of low energy by dieting, which we'll talk about in a second, but very much think of these as important, mechanistic, evolutionary processes that effectively have got us to this stage that we actually survived up until this point. So like I mentioned, the traditional thought process around calories in, calories out is based on this additive model. It's long been assumed that the more exercise you do, the more calories you burn, in that sort of like linear relationship between between activity and energy expenditure. So more is better. The more you do, the more calories you burn. But I want to propose a different model, which is a constrained energy model. And I mentioned this on the podcast recently around menopause. I mentioned Herman Ponce and his work around of metabolism as a whole. And again, he's at the forefront of this line of research. So we know that at low levels of activity, if you're completely sedentary throughout a day, you're not engaged in recreational activity, and you start doing a couple of walks a week, or you start doing a walk every day, and you go to the gym a couple of times, we know at first energy expenditure is additive up to a point. But beyond a certain point, we start to see the returns in energy expenditure start to flatten out as you enter into this sort of constrained zone where additional activity yields diminishing returns. And the total daily energy burn stops climbing because your body starts to reallocate energy from other systems to stay within a limited, constrained, sustainable range. And we see this evidence in research into hunter-gatherer tribes, where they've done research to actually look at caloric expenditure. So we recognize that hunter-gatherers are a lot more active than you and I. They're doing a lot more walking day to day than a Westerner would ever do. But the shocking finding was that they're actually not utilizing that many more calories as part of their overall metabolic rate than you and I. Instead, their bodies are self-regulating. And similar findings have been observed in like really high-level endurance sport, ultra athletes, where we see workloads being really, really, really high, and they're consuming a lot of calories to try and support it. And it seems that the maximum output, and this is still theorized and it still needs to have more research going into it, but it seems that the maximum amount of energy that the human body can utilize in any one day is around 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate. That seems to be the sort of like the ceiling in which the body can surpass. And that's been tested a lot, and it seems to be fairly consistent, even though we do need more energy, like I mentioned. So how does the human body compensate? So when activity starts to rise, when someone's being very, very active, adding in more runs, they're doing more walks, adding in more gym sessions, the first thing, as I mentioned, is NEAT. So non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That's the kind of like unconscious movement that your hands sort of move around. That just starts to reduce overall. We get more efficient as well. Your muscles, your movement patterns, how your mitochondria work becomes more economical. So the better you are at movement, the more consistent you are with exercise as a whole, the more efficient you get overall. You then get downregulation of other systems. Things like reproductive function, as I mentioned, is not in a situation where the body perceives low energy availability or where the body perceives too much energy being expended through activity. In that moment in time, reproduction is not an essential function. So therefore, the body can scale back on functions like that. It can scale back on inflammation, and it can scale back on things like the immune activity. Lots of things that can happen. And then there'll be some behavioral changes as well, or behavioral fatigue. There's a bit more tiredness, and you'll start like seeking rest or rest-seeking behavior outside of training. So even though you've been for a run, we've all done that at a weekend, gone for a long run, been totally whacked and just hit the sofa for the rest of the day. So your body effectively works in this sort of smart budget. If you start spending more in one area, it can quietly save in other areas overall. Context to this seems to matter. And I will say this does need more research, but it seems that the body will adapt more strongly in a sort of extreme caloric deficit. People with high levels of body fat may show a stronger downregulation in responses overall. Lower baseline activities, there's more room for energy to rise before hitting that constrained ceiling. Stress, illness, inflammation, the body can reallocate energy to prioritize systems like immune responses. And why all this matters, and this model helps to explain it, is why adding more cardio eventually stops the needle moving. Why fat loss will plateau even with like really, really high training loads, and why people really can't out-train a poor diet. It's not that your metabolism is slowing down. It's not that it's broken in any way. It is just your body's adjusting intelligently to sustain life within a sort of like safe range overall. So I mentioned there's this ceiling. Most evidence points that the sustainable amount of energy the body can use is around 2 to 2.5 times someone's resting metabolic rate. Beyond that, the body can't absorb and process enough fuel to sustain that output. So we can see like overfeeding when you have athletes that are training really, really, really high outputs for a sustained period of time, even with a nutritional strategy to allocate for enough energy, we start to see people can do it at first. You can push it temporarily, but you can't push it indefinitely. And that's where sort of like chronic overreaching and those sorts of things starts to reduce. So we see that in that situation where you're feeding athletes enough, they're still going to struggle to keep up with that output overall. And one of the things that's really interesting about this research that sort of came out earlier this year is there seems to be a really, really large individual variability and response to this. Some people compensate way more than others. As I mentioned, over short periods of time, there is still an additive approach. The challenge of this is knowing, well, Andy, at what point is it going from additive to being constrained? I think the biggest takeaway really is just doing more is not always better. I certainly talk to a lot of people on social media who are chasing body composition goals. They're eating in a caloric deficit and they're doing a lot of activity overall. And they're seeing a huge stalling in their ability to lose body fat. And it's very frustrating, obviously, because you're putting a lot of work into staying in the caloric deficit and you're putting a lot of work into exercising overall. And I've spoken about it before. This is kind of outside of the framework of this conversation, where, of course, behaviorally, if you're doing those things, you are more likely to start to trigger things like binge eating. So there is more than just this. But I want to keep within the kind of confines of this idea of adaptive metabolisms. We're still learning about hormones, mitochondrial efficiency, gut absorption, other factors. So I do appreciate that there does need to be more research in this space. But overall, the research from the data we've seen has shown that this is a self-regulating system and not a linear system overall. And I guess the big question there is, like, should we worry? Is it something that you should be worried about, that the human body has all these kind of really cool adaptations when it comes to energy? Not at all. The only thing you need to worry about, and this is where what's misleading on social media is, this really comes from chronic behavior, prolonged periods of underfueling, prolonged periods of overtraining. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It definitely happens. As I mentioned, I speak to many people on social media that fall into this category. But just understanding, hopefully, by what I've spoken through, is it's all kind of logical, right? It makes sense that the body, through an evolutionary standpoint, as we would have been hunter-gatherers going out foraging for food, like tracking animals, we can't just be burning more and more and more and more and more energy, because the energy needs that we would have to keep us alive will be far greater than the food we could bring in. So therefore, that's why this model starts to, or this why this our metabolisms need to be flexible in that kind of way. So anyone sort of stating about boosting your metabolism outside of what I'm about to say, you probably want to be a little bit skeptical of actually what's going on. So we know that eating enough protein and enough calories overall to be able to manage your training load. There is a very real reason why eating a little bit more and reducing overall expenditure actually could shift the needle, where you feel better in your training, you can push train a little bit harder, you haven't got this massive gulf between energy expenditure and energy intake, and actually you can start to then have some proper meaningful work. The challenge with a lot of this stuff is, I have definitely felt this in myself, where I've been training an awful lot and you just get used to feeling knackered all the time, and that is your norm, and it happens over a short period of time, or it happens over a sustained period of time. So you're not necessarily that aware of it. It's not until you get into a situation where you're fueling better, you actually realize that you're not as tired outside of sessions. So sometimes it's really hard to sort of know this whilst you're in it. But yeah, eating enough dietary protein, eating enough calories overall, strength training to preserve lean muscle mass is super important. Get enough rest, make sure you've got enough recovery. Like I mentioned, more isn't always better. And we have to recognize that every single human being out there is under a lot of stress, poor sleep, depending on the period of their life they're going through with work, children, really plays in on someone's ability to sort of fully recover and be able to go at whatever they're trying to do really hard. So doing these things ensures the body doesn't feel threatened from sort of this chronic underconsumption, chronic overtraining overall. And I guess the real practical takeaways here is, you can't fix or hack this. You can only support it. Anyone selling a product that is based around fixing a slow metabolism is lying to you. Metabolic adaptation, metabolic flexibility is a huge part of how we survived up to this point. We would always expect some sort of adaptation during dieting. Eating a sustained caloric deficit, there are going to be adaptations. As long as you're not going at that a really unsustainable approach, being too aggressive with your dieting, those adaptations are going to occur during a diet phase and then return back to baseline overall. It's only when we see people do things for a very, very, very long period of time or who are too aggressive with what they're doing that we actually see like long-term changes, which I know I've spoken about before. So as always, sustainable nutrition, sustainable training overall. And ultimately it comes to sort of, especially the conversation around diet phases, we want to make sure we don't elongate them too long, that we are in them for as long as we need to be, but we also have maybe periods where we come out of them and use maintenance phases. And as always, as I've said loads of times, we want to think of exercise around health, performance, and longevity, not around purely calories burned. So your metabolism isn't something you need to rev up or to fear. It's one of the most sophisticated systems in the body. It's constantly adjusting. It's constantly reallocating energy to keep you alive and for human function overall. So the real challenge isn't fighting it. It's just learning how it works and then working with it overall.